mediums of memory, and you can follow me there. We can think of carbon as one medium of memory. And we have no geologic record of the first 500 million years, though it's likely our planet endured volcanic, seismic, and impactful transformations. A weird mix of metals, minerals, and animate carbon provide us with a planetary memory of the 4 billion years that followed. And there are many attempts to frame and often hilariously decode the story of the planet's geologic record, which are at the core of many cultural debates. For example, the concept of the Anthropocene recently captured cultural institutions and a niche of climate scientists alike, and in my opinion, left a discursive stalemate in its wake. And I would say still, despite their increasing number, popular stories of the planet's geologic record often follow the trajectory of an overall linear progress, instigated by an originary event like the Big Bang or Adam and Eve in a garden. First came simple and then more complex organisms, just as first came nomadic and then sedentary societies. Today, however, with discoveries like Göbekli Tepe and books like The Dawn of Everything, things have started to shift this mainstream narrative towards understanding memory and the notion of time it delivers us as something kind of nodding, cyclical, or altogether a form of technic. So in this frame, you can ask then, what is the medium or mediums of memory? Or in the theme of this event series, what is the shape of lore? We can look to a book published in 1966, written by Frances Yates, called The Art of Memory. And she starts this book with the kind of classic tale of Hellenic or ancient Greek practice of memoria that was used in rhetoric tradition for thousands of years that followed the 2000. And in the story, basically, Simonides, an epic poet, was delivering a poem at a dinner party and went outside in the middle. And when he was conveniently outside, the building collapsed. And unfortunately and sadly for the guests inside, he had to go through their remains and remember them one by one, and had to imaginally walk through where they sat at the dinner table. And this practice of imaginally walking through a structure, inhabiting it, to recall different facts or a narrative, became known as the method of Loki. So the idea of a space imaginally conjured, real or not, to be able to store a narrative, overlapping facts or otherwise. This practice of memoria went on to inform other practices of how we conceive of the spatial nature of memory. So here's Giulio Camillo's Theater of Memory in one rendition from the 16th century, which takes on the shape of something like a public theater. But it reverses the kind of normal spectator and actor relationship, where it's assumed that the person inhabiting this theater stands on the stage, and they look up at the staircases of memory, somewhat hubristically in Camillo's kind of argument, the whole of human knowledge, like a MySQL database or something, basically looking up at it and being able to recite the facts that we have about the natural and, you could say, artificial world. And in each of these, the 7 layers corresponded to the 7 visible planets at the time. There's also practitioners like Giordano Bruno, the Renaissance polymath, who took different relationships to the planets and meditative practice for more effective memories and created different seals to store knowledge about them, astronomically as well as narratively. Another practice relating to the kind of heavenly bodies that became popular is that I think while we'll all be familiar with something like the Hellenic, or sometimes mistakenly termed the Western zodiac, the tropical zodiac, there's also a lunar zodiac. So this looks at basically 27 in 1, 28 places through which the moon goes through its cycles. Each of these places corresponds to one fixed star, so something observable for centuries in the night sky. And philosophers like Ibn Arabi then went through these lunar mansions or this lunar zodiac and paired different memories with each phase, be it animals or in this case different letters and sounds. And from these evoked a kind of early inscription or a spatial inscription, a planetary relation of narrative and language. And really interestingly, the year after The Art of Memory was published, Marshall McLuhan wrote a review of it, which we have saved in a little newspaper. And in the review, he likened memory palaces to forms of religious meditation that use a structure to store a story memorized through discrete images. These meditations can be revisited both through time, such as the liturgical year, the idea that holidays or holy days basically recur eternally in each kind of full circle of the sun, or through space, the Stations of the Cross, pictured here, which are 14 different stations remembering a historical life. And I think most interestingly, at the end of his review of the art of memory, McLuhan writes, Camillo affords the communication between the private memory system and the public theater as an image of the world. So in this conception, memory theaters introduce the notion of a public, or you could even almost say civic space, to the practice of memoria. So going from Simonides to now, we have a kind of civic form of imaginal architecture that could not only kind of create, or we say store, and recall knowledge, a problematic term which we'll come to, for an individual, but be traversed by others over time in perpetuity, as long as the structure was kept in mind. Another important work on this topic, with the kind of necessary picture, I guess, of Stonehenge on the front, is the 2014 book by Lynn Kelly called The Memory Code. In it, she tries to do a fairly global survey of different practices of memoria across cultures over time. She highlights a few examples, one of which is the Lukasa, which court historians, known as the Men of Memory, and the formerly kind of now known as the Luba Empire, would run their fingertips across the Lukasa to point to its features, while reciting genealogies, king lists, maps of protocol, migration stories, and epics. And clusters could represent lines of migration. And one common antihero in the stories, a red-skinned rainbow serpent, was often represented by the red bead, and other beads were often protagonists. But here, and in much of her work, I take a sort of epistemic issue, and that I don't think that it's that the red bead automatically represents a character, and it's one-to-one and kind of doing the work of carrying that memory. I would say that the story is constituted by this artifice or this physical device that's made, and in fact equally takes part in the crafting of the story rather than representing it over time. And as she looks at different examples, basically throughout the world, Chaco Canyon and elsewhere, she comes to a kind of similar conclusion, that basically this knowledge is very interesting across cultures because it held knowledge that was necessary for different cultures' survival. So basically what plants to eat, when to plant, etc. And I think that there's something in the way that the red bead saying represents a given character rather than takes part in the story itself. There's also a kind of assumption that this knowledge is worthwhile because it aided in some way in survival. When these stories were very much a part of a kind of culture, and the narrative and the kind of irrational or ineffable nature that they circled around were equally as important, and in fact inextricable from life or death. Instead, the thesis that I like the most from her book is looking at the different devices that were found that she surmises encoded memory. And one thing about them is, like with these strange ball figures here, is that they all tend to be somewhat irregular in nature or strange. And she looks at different kind of rock formations and says, oh, well, the indent here, because it's irregular on the stone face, allows one to store a special type of memory there. So it's actually the differentiation and the incompleteness of these artifacts that allow one to project memory onto them. And this is really in stark contrast to how we think about memory today as some sort of universal that needs to persist through time in a regular format and not decay. In fact, it's actually their idiosyncrasies that allow them to take part and actively craft stories. And to give a kind of false divide, I think, that gives us this conceptual model of a kind of universal form of memory, is to think about silicon memory. So there's the scene at the end of 2001, A Space Odyssey, where HAL has been deemed as a supercomputer to be against the crew, and the remaining crew member decides to remove his memory bit by bit, basically silicon chip by silicon chip, as though memory was a discrete kind of object stored across different objects over time that could be easily removed one by one, but somehow HAL still keeps singing a song. I guess it wasn't stored in one of the tapes. And this reflects also the idea we have of storing species in a kind of colonial nature over time, where they're discrete objects in a database compared and taxonomified, and so that later they can have machine learning or they can have other forms of cataloging done. But there's another version of kind of software memory that I think is worth mentioning, and that is looking towards something like a pattern language. So in 1977, Christopher Alexander and a team of architects published this book. And the idea was rather than a kind of top-down, blueprint-oriented architecture, instead you could craft a series of kind of vernacular statements, small patterns, and combine them to make a building. So for instance, it could be something like light on two sides of every room, a greenhouse, a facing outdoors that's always near the sun, a garden growing wild, and basically developing in a given site or culture these different patterns that make a place feel whole, that make a place feel culturally specific and lived in, and combining them to have a kind of vernacular of a space that evolves over time. And this idea of pattern languages actually really caught on in software development, but has a very funny origin story. So Ward Cunningham and Nancy Cunningham were very interested in the idea of pattern languages, and as pair programmers, they wrote a book to bring different types of best practices and patterns to the practice of software development. However, as Ward told me once, he was very surprised when they published the book because people said, oh, that's nice, but they really wanted a community around the book and around the pattern language to evolve it over time and to make it better, a kind of living language. But no one could interact with it this way. They said, nice book, and put it down. So Ward went back and basically thought, well, maybe a book is not the right medium for a pattern language. And in this, we have the origin story of the first ever wiki. So published in 1995, WikiWeb had the idea of a website that could be editable by anyone over time, directly inspired by the idea of pattern languages. And a lot of the online memory that we see today actually comes directly from wiki communities, whether it's game walkthroughs, different interviews, wholly generated lore around different communities, often are housed in these kind of software applications that are editable and over time. And I just want to make a point here that sometimes I think, for example, with the butterflies pinned in a drawer, we clearly have a colonial artifact there. And it's not one that we want to replicate. But also at the same time, we look at other artifacts that might feel like they are politically better. It could be a wiki. Oh, more people can participate. But I don't want us to get trapped in the idea that an artifact produces a given type of politics. It has affordances toward it, but it's not the sum total of it. So I don't present wikis as a kind of utopic software project, but just one that's more resilient to producing community memory over time. The politics of it will largely be determined by the culture. And as we can see, there are many issues with Wikipedia today. Just as with the Lukasa board that I mentioned earlier, it was often used to preserve an intensely hierarchical society, that the medium does not give us the politics, though it gives us a message. And all of this is just to say a kind of deep intuition in this talk is the idea that a memory exists when distributed. It is not something tied to a discrete object or a discrete part of the brain, the hypothalamus, but something that fundamentally exists between different agents. Or you could say it's also an extremely non-flat circle. It is something that is inhumanly alive, something particular, extremely against any notion of the universal, nodding, cyclical, and folding over itself. As Sam tweeted a couple years ago, it might be something about narrative culture in our age that fails to capture the deep time of mythic stories, that doesn't capture the mnemonic triggers that, for example, Ursula Le Guin was so good at crafting and layering throughout her worlds. And it could be, in fact, an issue of an approach to temporality. Today we have a kind of linear fate and cyclical destiny model. But this perhaps is unsuited to producing myths, which actually live in the storehouse of memory as kind of, not necessarily alive in the way that we're alive, but living objects in memory, rather than an extractive kind of discrete object model that we can plunder for treasure. And just as the memory maker in Blade Runner 2049 explains that anything real should be a myth as she cries looking onto her old memory, made synthetic and secretly shared again, we pass into myth and myth into experience again. So far from the totalizing universal that some want, memory always on some level acts as a messy vernacular, even when we start to conceive of synthetic memory running on silicon, and apart from extractivist models. And I would say that memory recall, while dependent on one or more subjects, it can be summoned independently of spatial or temporal limitations. And one can make an easy, although somewhat wrong, analogy that software, while dependent on a material substrate, similarly can be run independently of spatial or temporal limitations. And of course, in practice, memory and software face constraints. For example, when trauma blocks memory or a nation state blocks an IP address, But these constraints are not inherent to all of their instances. In its ability to be run, recalled, and actively transformed by a participant, the practice of software, as a practice, begins really closely resembling a practice of memoria, specifically the memory theaters of Camillo, which constitute memory as a public space, a virtual architecture for an incomplete image of the world. And in this form and this conception, software starts to look like the closest medium to memory itself we have produced. But it is also the most fragile and requires activation. And it could be for this reason that we still lack a common vocabulary or framework for understanding the memories that software itself produces. And I'm not arguing to return to the analog. Instead, we need to abandon the model of memory as a discrete object in a database, but instead have something like human and inhuman keepers of databases, one could say, kind of curators or guides that orient and pass on how to navigate them. And then we can start to think of software as a practice of memoria in its own right. And while wikis are probably one example more straightforwardly of how software is a form of evolving memory, I think as software as a practice of memoria, or of memory generation, will become more widely understood as large language models and other AI tools become more clearly interdependent and in fact inseparable from the software we interact with. So that will be part 2 of the talk someday. So in kind of simple summary, basically, if we borrow the classic net art diagram, my thesis is roughly that if we look at technology, memory doesn't happen stored in an artifact or stored in a human, but stored somewhere in between within human ecosystem or other agents, and that lore itself is not created by co-founders of a project that won't last a year, nor is it the stuff of managers. Lore is instead what happens when feedback from the worlds around us become articulated in mediums that outlast and outgrow us inhumanly. It's a type of memory that articulates its aliveness in its structure. And when prehistoric man cuts flint, obviously he doesn't cut the flint to preserve his memory, but the act of cutting the flint preserves in the stone the gesture of cutting, permitting the inscription of his gestures on the flint, and in fact constitutes a new memory support for the living being man. This is Bernard Stiegler. And he says, in essence, technics is memory support. And this means technics is the condition of the constitution of the relation to the past, or time. And I would say these memory supports provide a kind of collectivization of consciousness, the private memory palace turned into the public theater mentioned before. And I think Stiegler's kind of thesis that realizes a bridge between different types of memory to create a third is somewhat wrong, but that's out of the scope of the talk. But he was right in that it points to a new reading. So rather than tools applied to or carrying worlds, I think technology can be read most fruitfully as changes in the production of memory. Because as we face ecosystem forgetting, how we shape our memory of the world becomes incredibly important in prolonging it and supporting it and living with it. So the question of techniques is ultimately the question of politics. Should we raise that forest? Should we build that nuclear plant? What types of memory are we co-producing with the world around us? It is a political question, although abstract. And ultimately, this feedback loop between technology and memory, both alive in a way that is different than we're alive, is the stuff of lore. Thank you.